One of the most important pivots towards a 10x life is the reprioritization between the right of any parent to have however many children they choose to have with as many people as they choose to have them. And it's perfectly legal in most of Western culture that a man could impregnate 1,000 women, who is an alcoholic, who doesn't have enough money, who doesn't have any competent parental training, who has violent rages, and as long as he's able to seduce a fertile woman, it's not against the law. But the reality is that children without a competent, loving father do worse than children with a competent, loving father. Children without a competent, loving mother do worse than children with a competent, loving woman. And so I think the key shift is the bias is towards the child. And one of my commitments is not to have a child before an ecological community infrastructure that has a high likelihood of reducing and healing childhood trauma and being an enjoyable experience growing into a life. You know, it's a reality for myself that I have experienced 60% more pain and fear throughout childhood and into adulthood with recurring PTSD and trauma. The majority of my life has been filled with pain, fear, and the loneliness of being in a cult that is too incompetent to respond to it and that wants to look the other way. So majority of life in pain and fear, a very high majority around people that cannot and will not respond competently to pain and fear. And, you know, a 90% boycott on being welcomed and honored for bringing that into the circle, for bringing that to attention. That's my cult. So whether it's, so the range is between 60 and 99%, pain and fear in one form, because loneliness is a form of pain, and the fear of loneliness is a form of fear. So the bias being, is this a good time for the child? Do we have the competency as grown-ups? Have we become adults competent enough to raise a child? And I think the question becomes, do we have the competency to have healthy, non-traumatic relationships with one another? Because if I'm still having rage attacks with my wife, I'm obviously not in control of my emotional state. Well, who's that going to harm much more than, a grown-up? It's going to harm a child more, because the child is more in a more dependent relationship, and the child is a lot smaller. So every little flaw in the grown-up world hits a child harder because the grown-ups are so much bigger. So they have so much more impact on a child, on an infant. And so competent parental training, I think that, in one example of this that would be a massive step up over where we are now, number one, that we create the community largely without children. There's, could vary a little bit, but I don't think something that's this bold should be formed and experimented with infants for a number of practical reasons. Number one, even though it's a 10X community, there will be a lot of identity challenge and movement as one moves into a 10X community. Even though the work hours are much lower once it's established, the work hours are much higher, living two lives, building buildings and all of that initially. And so an infant needs to be your highest priority. And for those giving birth to a 10X community, it's important that they do so with that child being the highest priority. And it's important that that not conflict with an infant's right to have our undivided attention, to be our number one priority when they are born. And so forming the community without children, developing a stable level of well-being without children to demonstrate competency, and then inviting children into that space, potentially beginning with abused people in the larger community. You think of a place like India where you find orphans, on the street, etc., with no other options other than to be pimped out as beggars and have, body mutilations in order to accelerate the profits for the ringleader. When you've got highly abused children that need competent parenting, that's certainly something to consider before bringing a new child into the world. And I also think that it's a good idea if the majority of the community does not think that a parent has the competency to have a child, that it would be cruel and sociopathic to give birth to a child at that level of development. I think the community needs to take the stand for the child. And if an individual, it's hopefully someone that's interested in a 10X living community is healthy enough that if most of the people who know them really well think that they would harm a child just being who they are in the state that they're in, that they'd actually listen to that, because the vast majority of people are not interested in a 10X life or a 10X community. You don't find many drunks going around saying, I want to, join a 10X community. This is one of those areas that needs some teasing and working out over time. But this is a community that has as its first priority is the innocence of a child, which begins by not inviting such vulnerability and innocence into a sloppy relationship container.